Hi, this is Larry Groebe with Project Audion. As a bonus feature to go with our rediscovered Little Ham from Harlem radio soap opera written by Langston Hughes, here's the full interview I conducted about the poet's life and work with Dr. Vanessa Valdes, director of the annual Langston Hughes Festival held at the City College of New York. Welcome, and thanks for being here.
Thank you for reaching out. It's a pleasure to talk to you.
You know, I am amazed that, this festival started, 44 years ago? How did it get started, and how is it still going after 44 years?
So technically 45, only because it started in 1978, but we normally take place in November. And so we will be having two this 2023 calendar year. So this is the 44th. We will have a 45th in Cool. November 2023. So this was started in our English department and in collaboration with our Black Studies program, then department. And the whole process of it was really to honor writers of African descent. The City College of New York is located in Harlem, and there is no other writer who is as identified with Harlem as Langston Hughes.
That's true. And, let's just back up, because while many people, everybody I know, black and white, knows the name Langston Hughes. I mean, heck, I discovered last week that he's even given his name to the Harlem Candle Company and the Langston scented candle. Okay. I don't think they know a lot of the details. He's a name, he's just a name. Give me the short version of his background.
So he is born in the Midwest, which people don't know. I think, just saying they affiliate him with Harlem, they don't know he's not born and raised in this city. He wasn't. He was like so many people who came to this city in the early part of the 20th century as part of the Great Migration. And so he is born. There's some controversy about his birth because he was listed as being born in 1902. And I think maybe 2 years ago, they said, oh, actually, he was born in 1901, right? Which affects how we think about him even then and things like his centennial. And he's born to a prominent abolitionist family in history of abolition, right, in the Midwest. He has a very peripatetic existence. His father is in his life briefly. His father becomes frustrated with the United States, as many African Americans did. Again, I just said he was born in the first decade of the 20th century. His father moves to Mexico, right? His father leaves his mother, moves to Mexico. And so you have Langston Hughes going back and forth between those spaces. And so that kind of travel begins, right? First he lives with his mom, then his mother leaves him, to be with his grandparents, and then she gets married, and then she comes back. And so he is in constant movement in his early life. He then goes to, he at one point goes to the East Coast. He's in DC for a little bit. He's working as a waiter. He comes up to New York, right? This is where, he starts classes. He stops classes. He gets on a ship. He's working on it. And then he goes to Europe. And we're all talking before 30 years old, right? So we constantly see movement with him, and he is pulling from every space he goes to. And so he is most famous for inserting the blues in poetry, in having a blues idiom, in recreating the sounds of the blues in language. And, when we talk about African-American literature, we are talking about, prior to that point, there's this idea of dialect, right? And so that comes in the recreation of a replication or attempt to recreate an African-American Southern speech pattern, but that was not seen as valuable literature at the time. The valuable literature was recreating European forms, right, or what had been presumed as taken on as U.S. form, high literature, quote unquote. And so the idea of taking the speech of marginalized communities and putting respect on that and inserting that into literary forms, into written forms, recreating the oral in the written in a way that was not pejorative to the African American population. Langston Hughes is really the person that does that.
And he explored that in poetry, but he goes well beyond just the poetry and, as you said, the weary blues and the Negro dreams of rivers and the ones, you know, Raisin in the Sun. I think there's quite a few people who don't realize he gave that title. He gave Henneberry that title, you know. But he went beyond just
Hansberry
poetry.
Hansberry takes that from one of his poems. Right. Absolutely. And so it's interesting because there's a comfort in assigning him, this is him at his earliest space, right? So there's this idea, I think that there's a comfort in, you know, really aligning yourself with Langston Hughes at his most beautiful physically, at his youngest, right? This like upstart poet. Then we very quickly get into more complex areas, right? And I want to be clear, bringing in blues, that was controversial within the African American population. Like now we just assume like, no, this was widely embraced. It was not, because you still have a community that is, you know, we're talking about Jim Crow United States. We're talking about segregation. We are talking about full conversations about representation in the eyes of white society equals how best to be respectable, right? How best to be, what does it mean to be a race man or a race woman, right? It's to put your best foot forward. It is to be educated. W.E.B. Du Bois' talented 10th. And so there is comfort in that. And then as he moves on, he starts writing short stories. And then as he starts like going beyond genres and he start really being even more upfront about what it would take for the advancement of African Americans, including economic empowerment. You know, he starts dabbling with, you know, communist sympathies.
He went to Russia.
He absolutely did. And so you know, there's this idea of, again, there's comfort in just thinking about the quote unquote most simple version of Langston Hughes, when really that is a moment in his life. Right, he lives until the 1960s. Like, so I don't think enough people grapple with the 4 decades past, you know, the weary blues.
Well, so he wrote poetry. He wrote some novels. He did a couple biographies. He did 7 or so plays that I know of, and he tried his hand at radio too. Do you know much about his efforts in that area?
He was trying, I mean, here's the thing is that he was trying every single genre. He was also trying to get, you know, he at one point went to Hollywood, went to California, wanted to be a playwright or a screenwriter. You know, that's the reason why he went to Russia, was there was a whole group of African-American artists that went to Russia at a time when, you know, there was a movement like the center of cinema, right? Russia was a part of that, or the Soviet Union, because Stalin was already in power, and that, quite frankly, was why they had to run out. Right? But he takes that moment while he's in the Soviet Union, he also explores Central Asia, right? And so he's going to all these spaces and developing relationships and translating poetry over there and translating poets of Central Asian, written by Central Asian authors, and doing that. So every space that he goes to, he's translating, he's connecting across the board. And so radio was the genre that, you know, at a time when, you know, people didn't yet have TVs. And even when televisions came into play, that was still, I mean, that's an expensive gift. Oh, yeah. And so the most accessible technological form, I mean, you have right around the 1920s, you see a technological revolution, right? Because you had the gramophone, right? So that all of a sudden, like, people can purchase music and have it in their homes. The radios, again, allowed for entertainment in their homes in a way that people did not have before. And so, of course, you have not only music, but we have what has been lost for us in this current day, soap operas, right? At this moment, we have music and we have news programs and interview programs. But to have entertainment that we think of as visual, right? People don't think of soap operas in that form. So he was trying to get African-American representation, insert African-Americans in all the cultural forms possible.
But in 1943, there was not going to be a chance in the world, really, that an all-black soap opera was going to happen, really.
Well, I
Unfortunately.
mean, it's interesting because you have, so 2 decades prior, you have Shuffle Along on Broadway, right? So that was an all black cast, right? So you have the different cultural forms, but it just, as it moves, right? You have new obstacles, right? So whereas someone, I mean, it's not impossible to think that he would aspire to that, given, again, by this time, you not only have in the visual form of film, we have Oscar Micheaux and his films,
Mhm.
right? You also are having more and more African American artists, actors, at the time in Hollywood. So if I'm not mistaken, Stormy Weather is at the same time
Yep.
in 1943, right? So
There,
it's
there were guest
it's
star, yeah, there were guest stars and there were sidekicks in the 40s, and about 10 years later, they tried to actually create what they called the National Negro Network, which started up in January of 1954. But unfortunately, television was around, and that didn't happen either then.
Well,
I
and
mean,
here's the other part is that, like, I mean, we're talking during the Second World War. I mean, you have the WPA doing all kinds of projects.
true.
So again, here in New York, right, you have the rise of like American Negro Theater. You have like all of these all black ensembles and all black collectives are happening. So it's just a question of where, what that WPA looked like in New York City, and then you go out, and then it's like, oh, maybe it doesn't have, maybe it's not the same. Like it wasn't evenly applied across the country, I will say, because again, Harlem was recognized as the center of Black America.
No, he's quoted as saying he can do some one-shot writing, but no one wants to offer him a regular show. And even the shows that did feature some African Americans or focused on that, like Beulah, which was a show at the time, is written by a white writer. So, and this show, and I don't know that you've had a great chance to preview this script, is very distinctive. I mean, nobody is a maid, but there are no white personages showing up at all, and it is set absolutely in Harlem. In fact, our modern day cast in our rehearsal said they were challenged by this dialogue because there's a distance of time between how he wrote and the way they spoke back, how he, I almost want to say transcribed what he heard back then into this script and what we have today. And it really is of its time.
Well, and I think that that's, again, that's what can be challenging, right? Because in this current historical moment, we still are facing these questions. I think all marginalized populations face the questions of what does representation mean? What does true inclusion mean? It's that balance of here's the best of us, and then it's here we are, like warts and all, and so what is the more valid? That has been an incredible tension in the history, not only of the African American community in terms of advancement and social mobility, right, but all marginalized populations, right? Is do we embrace every single part of our community? Mm-hmm. Again, racially, ethnically, in terms of sexuality, right? Or do we, let's just focus on this because this segment can really, this is more palatable, right, to the rest of society. Mm-hmm. So let's just focus on that. And so I love the fact that the current cast is probably feeling, it is very close to probably what people felt in his time. Again, that kind of, why does he insist on these characters, on these people, right? And from his perspective, it's no, this is us. This is the best of us, all of it, not just, again, I referenced Du Bois's Talented 10. Right?
They may be challenged, but they're also laughing. This is a funny show, and very much a soap opera as well. I mean, the lead character, as we'll hear, has an ex-girlfriend who's suing him for $700 for breach of promise, while a new lady customer walks in, and he's immediately smitten by her. And so he's a little sharp character, and it's both funny, and it's very much a soap opera of the time. You can see how he would have kept this going week after week. In fact, some of the notes show some of the situations that he would have put them into nightclubs and things like that. And the other thing that I find fascinating about this, which would have been a challenge for any show at that period, was A, it's a soap opera, B, it's a comedy, and C, it has music interpolated. The characters are supposed to sing and play the git fiddle, which I'm going to have to admit we're cutting that part down quite a bit because it's hard to find good git fiddle players these days. But the music was I think it's fascinating because that was a big part of it, and there we go right back to what you were saying, integrating the jazz and the blues, and two or three characters sing that literally are supposed to sing the blues in this script.
I mean, I think it's interesting because, so first off, here in New York City, one way you know when the weather is getting warmer is because almost every single community in this city starts blasting music. And so we know that remains the marker of it. But I think any city that we can think of where there's particularly live instrumentation like that is probably New Orleans, right? New Orleans at this moment continues that history of, you can just turn the corner and you'll see, like you'll see a band or you'll see somebody. And the reality is, again, that was a great characteristic of so many communities across this country that we have lost because of technological advances, right? Because of, now we all have Spotify and, any other number of streaming services. But, at the time, at the early part of the 20th century, into the mid-20s, until quite frankly, maybe like the 80s, right? Everyone played music. I mean, music classes was a part of curriculum across this country. And so just things like that, and what I also appreciate is he is underscoring how very integral the arts are to life, right? And there's no separation, right? Again, that's something that we've lost, I think, into this 21st century, right? This idea of like, there's a kind of professionalization that has happened even amongst our young people, so that they don't just want to dabble in things, because as a society, we don't encourage that kind of curiosity.
It's a good point.
Yeah. A century ago.
That's a good point. In many ways, we've lost amateur status.
Wow. I mean, everyone feels like they have to be an expert in something versus just, I think there was a certain sense of just curiosity, right? There was a certain sense of, if you wanted to hear that kind of music, like you could wander into a music store that sold instruments, right? And you could just, somebody's going to have a secondhand something, or somebody around the block used to play and therefore could give you lessons, or, again, I think about, someone like Harry Connick Jr., who would talk about the Marsalis family, right? And really how he just grew up and kind of wandered, and that whole family kind of took him in. And so that kind of just, improvisation, curiosity, I don't know that we have it in the way that we used to as a country.
No, I don't. I think you're right. Well, it would have been interesting to had this show going on the air to see what that would have led to. He, as you said, he had this was scripted in about 1943, based on the research I've got, from the characters in a play that he created in 1935. But he had another 25 years almost to go until the late 60s. And he passed at a time when some great changes were just starting to happen, both in culture and race and in media. It wasn't very many years, and here we are now with, Shonda Rhimes and Jordan Peele, and people who are not thought of as specialty black creators at all. They're just creators. I'm trying to sum up kind of where he fits in all that.
I mean, again, I think he has been, the multiplicity of his skill set, I think, has been lost, again, because it's just more comfortable. But I do think that this project goes a ways to a restoration of his complexity as a writer and as a creator. I also want to say, there was a time when he was considered passé. He was considered, an older generation. Every generation does, right? Like they kind of look, they turn around and they're like, ah. And so he had been dismissed for a little bit by a certain portion of um, everyone, really, And so it's an interesting thing because I think to fully restore him is to recognize all that he did. He was also integral to the dissemination of Haitian literature in particular. He translated Haitian literature. He wrote children's books on Haiti with Arna Bontemps. He also translated Cuban literature. His things, his poetry and work was translated into Spanish. So we're talking about someone who is multilingual, multi-genre, and the reality is there aren't too many people who do that today. I mean, we think about the phrase Renaissance man, right? And whereas the Harlem Renaissance is thought of as, this high modernist point within African American literary tradition or cultural tradition. There are not too many who were there were several who were creating in that way, but for the length of time that he was creating and in as many genres as he was creating, we don't yet have a full appreciation for all he was doing.
Harlem Renaissance man, I like that. So now I understand why there's a festival that goes for 44 years, 45.
Yes.
Tell me,
Absolutely.
tell me about the one that I guess as people watch this, most of them, it will have just happened a few days before. Tell me about this one and your honoree this year and past honorees, because I was really blown away by that.
Yeah, so this year we are honoring Lynn Nottage. Lynn Nottage is primarily known as a playwright. She is the only winner of 2 Pulitzer Prizes for drama. Last year, she had 3 works on Broadway at the same time. So she is the creator of MJ the Musical, which is a musical about Michael Jackson. She also had written a play years ago called Intimate Apparel, which she had written the libretto for the opera. And so that was on last year in Lincoln Center Theater. And she also wrote the play Clydes, which in this current season is the most widely produced play in the United States. And so this is the reason, given everything I just said about Langston Hughes and his multiplicity of genre, here is a woman who is writing and who is creating in that same vein of why just this genre, right? But why not all of these genres? And that actually speaks to many of our honorees. I mean, we've honored everyone from James Baldwin to Toni Morrison and Paul Marshall and so many of our greatest writers here in the United States. And I will say in our most recent past, last year we honored Jamaica Kincaid, who is a Caribbean American writer. The year before that, in 2020, we honored Michael Eric Dyson, given that was the fall after the reckoning of the summer of 2020, right? And so here is a man who has written about 20 some odd books, right? And is one of our most powerful cultural critics. But we've also honored Hilton Als, Zadie Smith, and Tazaki Shange. I mean, again, just writers who write across genre and really shine a light on what it is to be Black in its most ample form here in the United States, be it Caribbean, being African American, being, just all the spaces. And so, yeah, this is what we do is we continue to highlight, using our namesake, continue to highlight the breadth of and richness of African American cultural forms.
That's terrific, and thank you very much for all that. I love your enthusiasm. If I wanted to send someone off to explore Langston Hughes, to turn him from just a picture over here to someone real, where should they start? One of his works, or is there a biography? I mean, I know there's a couple gigantic biographies, but I think
Yes.
is there a place to dive in?
I think depending on how old you are, I do think the Weary Blues is a great place to start. I do think that his first collection of poetry is a great place to start. I think that if you are interested in knowing he was born here, walked here, did the Rampersad biographies, which are 2 volumes, are actually incredibly accessible. And so don't be scared by how big they are. But they are incredibly well written and in depth. And the thing about Langston Hughes is that he kept everything. I mean, every receipt, every program, every flyer. And so what you see, his papers are at the Beinecke Library at Yale University. And what you see is one recognizes that those biographies are he was going through a lot going through a lot of papers to be able to produce those 2 volumes.
Yeah.
But yeah, no, I mean, I think those are 2 places. And again, there are also, those are 2 welcoming places. And there is I think the Library of America, if I'm not mistaken, has produced a collective works of his. So there they do highlight, there's a volume on his translations, there's a volume on his essays. And so there are a number of places that one can look to find Langston Hughes. And if you are in Harlem, by any chance, I would encourage everyone to come to the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture, which is on 135th Street and Malcolm X Boulevard, because there, in fact, is where Langston Hughes's remains rest. His ashes are in that space in the lobby. The Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture is the premier archive for everything related to global Black history. It has 11 million items, books, artifacts, drawings, musical recordings, any document that you want to research Black people in Iran, you can find it at the Schomburg Center. And you know, that's his resting place.
Well, worth a visit. I wonder, it doesn't sound terribly far from the Singing Shine Parlor, the 4-chair stand in a hole in the wall on Lenox Avenue.
Exactly.
Yep. I'm Larry Groebe, and this was a special Project Audion presentation. Thanks for watching.